Thank you. What I propose to do is to shift the main point about power and influence to the whole question of power and responsibility, and how do we look at the dynamics of power and responsibility at the margins. And I think the previous presentation anticipates some of the points that I want to make here, and the reason why I chose, when I was asked to speak on the Indian experiences of the question of responsibility, and the way at the global level power and responsibility are dissociated. While Susan, for example, was speaking of the northern and the southern phases of the local situations, this is something that I want to speak of, and therefore I'm grateful for some of the aspects that she brought out. Europe's current migration crisis follows Europe's currency crisis. And now that Europe has its own, I do not know whether you were familiar with the word kafila. Kafila is an Arabic word, but it's also an Urdu word which means caravan. And it is considered to be a part of normal life. And now that Europe has its kafila, perhaps it may also learn something about this from the post-colonial world. After all, India faced a refugee flow of much greater magnitude. About 10 million refugees in 1971 from the erstwhile East Pakistan to India for more than a year. And I cannot remember such doomsday panic then. And life rolled on as it still does as a kafila. In such a time, I suggest that a partial shifting of the goalpost may be done here on the basis of the Indian experiences, which are reflective of worldwide post-colonial experiences. We have to ask, what is the nature of this power and influence at the margins? More critically, what is the nature of power and responsibility at the margins? This is important because unlike the Kantian world, the world we live in is characterized by the great dissociation of power and responsibility. For instance, wars may be imposed on countries by great powers, but the burdens of refugee flows that wars create are shouldered often by countries that had little to do with the wars in question. Yet, through all these years, the global refugee regime never questioned this dissociation, primarily for two reasons. First, in the age of democratic responsibility, it is taken to be resting with the people, who must conduct themselves responsibly to prove that they are masters of their own destiny. They must self-determine, while power will be exercised always by outsiders or by the corporate class. This paper will therefore examine how the experience of refugee flows into India since independence has conditioned our engagement with the global refugee regime, including the contradictions in the state policy towards refugees and the policy of giving asylum. In the context of the Indian history of providing asylum, this paper will argue that the relation between care and power is not a simple causal one, namely that by caring one amasses power. The relation is complex. The arrangement of care is not simply flowing from the sovereign legal authority at the top. The heterogeneity of power builds up and draws on the heterogeneity of the act of caring. The more multiple is this universe, the more complex is the game. At the same time, the dispersed state of responsibility orients the power to care. This situation, perhaps rightly termed as strategic ambiguity, in short will be the basis of a post-colonial interrogation of the global protection regime of the refugees and the stateless. Now, the Indian story of hospitality, if in terms of a study of the refugee protection by the Indian state, three questions demand attention. One, how India defines the term refugee and its scope. Second, the way it defines the concept of non-refoulement, the principle of no forcible return and its scope. And third, the administrative judicial machinery to determine the status of a shelter seeker as a refugee, and once determined, where does the refugee feature in such policy formulation? It also means trying to understand where does we know that Easy means of physical accessibility, cultural and economic networks, and political support of host government and communities have been significant elements in the determination of a policy on the refugees. These are elements that impel care, but these elements add to the power of the state also to decide towards whom to extend hospitality and whom to deny. In the South Asian subcontinent, partitioned not once but twice, the politics of nationhood is built upon experiences of how some could become citizens and some could not. We know that India did not sign the Refugee Convention of 1951 or the additional protocol. Many have therefore turned the history of how refugees were saved, cared and rehabilitated in this country, while many were left out, refused and neglected in the same period and in the same country by this term strategic ambiguity. For instance, refugees from Burma were welcomed at one point, ignored at another, and prevented or obstructed from entering India at yet another point. One observer has called it the full circle. Similarly, while some groups of refugees, such as the Tibetans, were almost allowed to be Indianized, some other groups, such as Sri Lankan refugees, spent and do still spend long years in India in strictly watched camps. An expert, after examining the logical structure of these contradictions and ambivalence in the Indian state's asylum policy, has termed it as this well-known term of ambiguity. In some cases, for instance, after the birth of Bangladesh, the refugees were sent back quickly in hundreds and thousands in early 1972, while in other cases, they have remained for over decades. The Indian state, in the later case, did not pursue any solution even to persuade the refugees to go back, as in the case of Tibetan refugees. We have also another group of cases such as the Chittagong Hilltrack refugees in Tripura or Sri Lankan refugees in Tamil Nadu, whom the Indian state allegedly wanted to repatriate forcibly. These cases of differential treatment of refugees and asylum seekers do not, however, exhaust the full story of Indian hospitality. Many writers have chronicled how, as opposed to these vagaries, refugee care in post-partition Punjab and Bengal became part of building the new nation in India. Writing of the post-1947 care and rehabilitation of the refugees from East Pakistan, one chronicler commented, within quote, "The history of relief and rehabilitation in the East is one of gradual emplacement within a national body of those who were victims of one of the worst population displacements. The travels and the trauma that accompanied their emplacement are only reflective of our own growing nationhood." In this dual context of nationalism and displacement, there was not only a re-emphasis on the category and role of partition refugees as elements of nation building, but also a reinforcement of the state's duty to care and the imperative on its part to mobilize all power at its command to that end. Indeed, to justify its status as the repository of power, the state had to re-articulate its obligation to care. Thus, neither the security explanation, nor the kindness explanation, nor even the international law and international regime explanation will be adequate in making us understand the mysteries behind one of the most observed and least comprehended political phenomena of our time, namely the asylum and refugee care policy of a post-colonial state. Against the background of several major population movements across the borders into India, in the last 68 years and the differential attitude of the Indian state towards same, we must summarize, first of all, the 10 major features of this situation. First, the first refugees to arrive in independent India were not aliens who had to be given shelter. They were considered to be part of the nation. The first practices of refugee care and administration was built up through not so much law as practices of care, rehabilitation, and social security. Institutions are the concrete results of these practices, and few laws resulting in a durable tradition of hospitality which the state can neither fully endorse nor embrace, nor can reject. Partition refugees have left a deep mark on the subsequent pattern in which the state has combined care with power, and this is the mark of ambiguity. The contest between notions of charity and rights that began as soon as refugees first started pouring in has influenced the subsequent discourse of hospitality. Because offering shelter and protection became deeply circumstantial and episodic, including the issue of near permanent residence much beyond temporary visitation, local communities developed their durable and double response of charity and fatigue, benign care and ill-feeling and animosity, a response that characterized the conduct of the state also. Local response and responsibility turned out to be as important as state behavior in influencing public policy on refugees and asylum. Finally, what the Convention of 1951 was powerless about is that the state system would finally decide the relation between visitation and residence. Thus, refugees who thought on arrival in 1947 that they would go back did not, and were in all seriousness never told by the state to go back. Similarly, the Tibetan refugees have not been told to go back or repatriated. On the other hand, hundreds and thousands of refugees from East Pakistan were sent back as soon as the year of War of 1971 was over. Some of the Chakma refugees flowing into India in successive phases stayed, some went back, and some had to be induced to go back. Refugee flows in India thus in time became massive and mixed. Possibly it had always been so. The foundational history of care in independent India involves countless shelter seekers who formed one of the most mixed and massive flows of the world. Now, the two discourses have become linked, the issue of illegal immigration and that of the refugees. One influence predicates and prejudices the other. One of the important things in building up this ambiguous scenario is the role of judicial reasoning in the country. How has the justice system in India responded to the deeply equivocal relation? That is therefore an important question. How has judicial reasoning taken shape in such a context? Elsewhere I have written it in details on this. Here I can only confine myself to few instances of judicial reasoning in India. By and large, trial court decisions seem to have relied upon no standard practice or law of asylum. There have been variations. When courts have imposed fines on the refugee offenders, in some cases they had to pay with the help of charitable organizations and NGOs. If the refugees had been fortunate to get UNHCR protection, they had been let free. In some cases, though not always, courts have allowed the persons to approach the UNHCR. But in other cases, the reasons of state in form of FA, that is Foreigners Act, seem to have held sway over judicial reasoning. In several cases, the High Court decisions seem to confirm the stand taken by the trial courts, particularly with regard to appeals by Burmese nationals under detention and jail custody not to deport them and allow them to approach UNHCR for protection. Indeed, the Gujarat High Court, in one of the cases, summarized the position of the Indian judiciary. First, the relevant international treaties and conventions are not binding on the state, but there is a moral obligation on the government to respect them. Second, Article 21 of the Indian Constitution, which is the right to life, is enjoyed also by a non-citizen on Indian soil. It implies the principle of non-refoulement, but this does not confer on the non-citizen any right to reside and resettle, nor does it mean that if the stay of a non-national is contrary to national security, she or he can stay. Third, in case where the national covenants and treaties reinforce the fundamental rights in India as facets of those rights, they can be enforced. Fourth, the power of the government to expel a foreigner is absolute. Fifth, the work of the UNHCR in certifying refugees is a humanitarian work. So the government has an obligation to ensure that refugees receive international protection until their problems are solved. And finally, in view of Article 51, which enjoins upon the state, it's a directive principle to respect the ideals of international peace, it directs the state to respect international legal principles. The courts will apply those principles in domestic law in a harmonious manner, provided such obligations are not inconsistent with domestic law. There is one more important thing in how India manages population flows in the country, into the country. Between 1950 and 1975, the Indian state signed treaties of peace and friendship with Bhutan, Sikkim, Nepal, Burma, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and an odd pact with Pakistan on the minorities. These treaties bore assurances of friendship on behalf of an independent and an anti-colonial state in the milieu of the early 50s. These agreements were based on and reproduced the geopolitical imaginary of an imperial nation engaged with issues of both territory and population. The agreement between India and Sri Lanka on the Indian Tamil plantation labor in Sri Lanka is an example. Territory was fixed, so also was the attempt to fix the population. Like combating famine, combating population instability was a matter of great concern, and therefore in all these bilateral treaties, the issue was addressed, which included also the right to return of the population groups like the Indian Tamil plantation labor in Sri Lanka who had stayed there for more than 100 years. We can also mention the stateless population groups in the country and in the subcontinent. Any primary researcher on refugee studies knows that the situation of protracted displacement and refugee code may lead to potential loss of citizenship in home country and as a consequence, de facto statelessness. A serious investigation into conditions of statelessness in India will bring out once more the disjunction between the formal protection regime led by the UNHCR and the actually evolving norms, conditions, and protection practices. The framework of protection practices for the stateless in India is distinctly post-colonial. It is derived from the partitions and the decolonization process in the region where nowhere people abound in the borderlands and is at odds with the dominant paradigm of protection of stateless, which emphasizes the requirement that the state from where the stateless have arrived and the state where they look forward to for protection must recognize that the groups or individuals or communities are not their citizens. International legal wisdom, known in certain Indian human rights circles as within quote Geneva-based wisdom, is therefore inattentive to the ways in which de facto statelessness in the post-colonial context is seen less as a positive definition, that is a definition that sets out complete conditions for statelessness, but more as a refraction of a positive reality known as citizenship. Citizenship is seen as an institution that always within quote a slightly philosophical term incompletes itself. Actual experiences of statelessness therefore offer a definition that bases itself on a kind of displacement of a reality, you might call it the reality or a hyper-reality of citizenship, that always seems to fall short of the reality of citizenship, entitlements, and legal protection. One can see from Indian experience that while statelessness may emerge from succession of states or territorial reorganizations, it can also emerge from persecution of minorities due to a state's majoritarian bias. Bhutan is a great example of that. And consequent displacement, which may lead to lead to the phenomenon of statelessness. Now, on the basis of all this, one can ask, what is then the other scene of power when we are discussing the question of power and influence? So I shall, refer to two or three conclusions. The other scene of power and influence in the global refugee regime is that of power and responsibility at the margins. In the background of decolonization, partition, structural reforms, and environmental disasters, the nature of population flows in and from the post-colonial world is mixed and massive. Earlier legal definitions of the victims of forced migration and their protection norms are now starkly inadequate. It is important, therefore, to study the local dynamics of power and responsibility with regard to issues of protection practices for the victims of forced migration. All in all, one can argue that in the context of all these, the power and influence of the global refugee regime at the margins is largely ineffective. And finally, the plural ways in which responsibility of protection and hospitality is carried out in the post-colonial world suggest that we must accept legal pluralism as the foundational principle for rebuilding the architecture of protection. But this is a topic which requires another paper or another 15 minutes. Sorry.